Great. Hello, everyone, and thank you for joining Groundwork USA and the Center for Creative Land Recycling for our second Brownfield Curious webinar, Understanding the Brownfield Reuse Process and Timeline. So I'm Julissa Gilmore. I'm the Senior Manager of Environmental Justice Programs at Groundwork USA. And so for those of you who aren't familiar with Groundwork USA, we're a national environmental nonprofit who's really the support organization and capacity organization for a network of over 20 community-based organizations working to make their communities greener, healthier, more resilient, and just. And you can see our network map right here on the screen of our groundwork trusts throughout the country. And so this webinar today is brought to you by Groundwork USA's nonprofit Brownfield Technical Assistance Program. It's a nationwide technical assistance program that's specifically tailored to nonprofits, really working to increase the capacity of nonprofits that are working in communities with brownfields and helping to transform those spaces into community assets using environmental justice and equitable development as guiding principles, and also to help improve public health in their communities. This is nationwide free technical assistance. And as part of that program, we have these webinars and workshops like the one that you all are on today. We also offer direct technical assistance, and we have a library where there's a bunch of different tools, resources, and guides to help anyone in their brownfield reuse journey. So I encourage you to check out our website to check all that stuff out. And I also want to mention one of our newest technical assistance offerings, our environmental justice and land use learning cohort. So this is a free 6-month virtual program that's really designed to help nonprofits effectively lead brownfield site reuse projects. And so we're looking for individuals that represent nonprofits or community organizations to participate in this 6-month training. And so you'll have 6 small group workshops that run from October 2024 to March 2025. The application deadline is September 13th, and we'll put the link in the chat for this learning cohort. And really, this is focused on, exploring real world tools and case studies. You'll be creating an actionable strategy for brownfield land reuse. You'll get one-on-one direct technical assistance by participating in this cohort. And then you'll also have access to a community of peers, other nonprofits or community-based organizations who are working on similar brownfield issues, want to really focus on environmental justice, where you all can learn from each other. And we'll also be co-facilitating this with the Center for Creative Land Recycling as well. And so just so you all can get kind of a taste of what we'll be chatting about in this land reuse and environmental justice cohort, we'll do an intro to brownfields and environmental justice, talk a little bit about brownfield site visioning, talk about partnerships, roles, and responsibilities, equitable community engagement in session 4, communicating site risks to stakeholders in session 5, and then end the learning cohort with financing brownfield redevelopment stages, stakeholders, and strategies. So there's a lot of information there. Again, the application deadline is September 13th, and the learning cohort will start in October of this year. So again, the link should be in the chat. So stay tuned for that. And if you're signed up for our newsletter, you'll get some more information about that, I believe, later this week. And so with that, I want to pass it to Claire Weston, the Senior Program Manager at the Center for Creative Land Recycling. She manages their technical assistance to Brownfield program. So I'll pass it to Claire.
Thank you so much, Julissa, and welcome everyone to this webinar. This webinar is going to be a bit of a taste of what you can learn in that learning cohort. So if you like what you see here today and have your interest piqued, then I definitely recommend applying, because I'll just give it to you straight. you're going to have questions after this webinar. We're not going to be able to give you a full download of the Brownfields process in an hour, I'm afraid. So the Center for Creative Land Recycling, very similar to Groundwork USA, supports brownfield redevelopment practitioners, including nonprofits, municipalities, government organizations, through the land reuse process, okay? And so what does that mean? Well, we're the technical assistance to brownfields provider for 8 states and numerous territories around the country, EPA regions 9 and 10. That's the entirety of the West Coast. But in our capacity here today, we're partnering with Brownfield USA on this national webinar. So what does our technical assistance look like? Well, it actually looks a lot like Groundworks in a number of ways. We also provide one-on-one technical assistance. We also do webinars, workshops, conferences, and have a library of resources. So we can help get you started on your redevelopment journey. We can help you stay on track. Redevelopment, as you'll see from Danielle's presentation, can have some bumps in the road, and we can help you navigate those. And we can help you get the job done to really reach that end use that makes your community pop, makes it shine. So that's what our speaker today, our content expert, is really going to dive into. Before I introduce her, I do want to hear from you guys about what challenges you face when you are endeavoring on land reuse and brownfields redevelopment. So specifically, what barriers are you encountering? This poll, which I'm going to explain it, go ahead and scan that QR code, or go to menti.com and use the code that you see here on the screen to participate. This is a word cloud, so any word that comes to mind, any challenge you encounter, any hurdles you have to overcome, and it can be as simple as getting started. Where do I start? I don't know where to start. If that's your biggest challenge, then you should say that. Others that some people might mention include funding, building partnerships, identifying stakeholders. Whatever hurdles you encounter, go ahead now and take a second to scan the code, or use the address up there and the code up there to submit your answers. Oh, we've got some coming in. Okay, I knew it. Funding was going to be huge. So the largest words means the greatest number of answers. So we're going to let this run here for a second. So community engagement, capacity, that's one we hear all the time. Complicated. It is complicated. We're going to get into some of that to try and smooth out some of those complexities. Where to start, funding remains the biggest issue. Where to start is still also very big. Stakeholder engagement. Okay, we are definitely starting to see some trends emerging here. Just transition, application process. Okay, so we've got some big ones that are really coming to the top, including capacity, where to start, funding, getting started, and stakeholder engagement. Okay, this is really, really helpful to see where people struggle. I mean, we're familiar with this, but it's really validating to see some of the challenges that people encounter. Order of operations, that's a really interesting one. I think that we can dive into that, because that is tricky. I think a lot of people think of the process as a straight line. It unfortunately is not, and we'll talk a little bit about that nuance. Awesome. Okay, thank you all so much for participating in that poll. I'd now like to introduce our content expert for today, Danielle Getzinger. She is the CEO of Adapta, and formerly the CEO and co-founder of Community Lattice, which merged with Adapta in 2024 to accelerate community-driven development, environmental remediation, and climate justice with innovations in data science and AI. Danielle is a licensed professional geologist with over 17 years of direct experience managing environmental assessment and cleanup projects. And she is nationally recognized for her brownfields redevelopment expertise, working closely with government, private entities, and grassroots nonprofits on complex environmental remediation projects, revitalization plans, and environmental justice initiatives in communities across the United States. All right, I'm going to pass it to Danielle. Thank you so much for being here today.
Thank you all for having me. Let me switch to showing my desktop, and you can see that, right? We're good.
Yes.
Okay. Awesome. We'll get started. First, again, thank you for allowing me to present today and for thinking of me for this important webinar. I heard a lot of just getting started being a biggest barrier. And hopefully this this webinar will help in that regard to find the first step in this crazy but worthwhile process. Feel free to drop your questions along the way into the chat. And I know that folks are going to be Claire and Jaleesa are going to be monitoring that. I'm happy to dive into it, either address it immediately or we'll open this up for Q&A in the end. Claire already gave an introduction of who I am, CEO of Adapta, and we do a lot of technical assistance around brownfields redevelopment at this intersection of economic development, planning, environmental issues, climate issues, all of the issues, right? It's a very niche and specialized field. So I have a lot to cover. If I'm going too fast, please slow me down because this is, there's a lot and there's no way we can fit everything into one webinar, but we're going to try. So that real quick is just the agenda for today. We're going to do a recap of what you heard on the last webinar, or if you didn't join that webinar, here's some basics. Then dive into risk and complications of brownfields, the redevelopment process, present some resources, and hopefully, and I will intentionally save time here at the end for a question and answer time. So let's just ground ourselves in what is a brownfield. I know you had a whole webinar on what is a brownfield, but it's good to remind ourselves of the definition specifically as a property, the expansion, redevelopment, reuse of which may be complicated. That's the key point, may be complicated by the presence or potential presence of hazardous substances, pollutants, or contaminants. I'm going to bring this definition up again as we go because that really opens a whole lot of opportunity, that people overlook. And one distinction is that it is not a Superfund site. A lot of people think that a brownfield is a Superfund site. And if you're working within the communities and the general public doesn't know the difference. So a lot of what you're going to be doing as you develop brownfields is explaining this is not a Superfund site. So where I like to start is saying that every brownfield, every property is a brownfield until proven not guilty. And you might prove it not guilty out of the gate. You might say, you know what, this is a vacant land and it hasn't been touched for centuries. And it's not, there's no presence or potential presence of contamination. But in the work that we do, especially in the work in urban environments, when we're stepping into communities that have economic distress or just are looking for redeveloping land, a lot of those properties are considered brownfields because of the potential presence of contamination. And by taking this proactive mindset, then you're putting more of these properties back into reuse, and you're also identifying the risk early on. Much rather identify the issues early on so that it does not become a big risk to the project later on. So again, so many of these properties are overlooked as brownfields, and that means the funding and the incentives are overlooked for getting them back on the tax roll. And then by having this proactive approach, you are preventing, or helping to mitigate the risk in the future as you go through redevelopment, as you maybe find an underground storage tank, what we call ghost tanks on the site because you didn't do your due diligence beforehand. It's also a broader definition, again, so you can maximize those incentives. And one of my favorite stories, and I'm not going to play this video because it's going to take up too much time, but go to Pulaski County's Brownfields website. They had the USS Tioga, which was a tugboat from World War II, from Pearl Harbor. They had that designated as a brownfield to do lead abatement on it. And if they can get a boat designated as a brownfield, that really opens up the opportunities for brownfields. So let's reduce the stigma. Let's, look at these as opportunities. And I heard that from the last webinar, that people see the opportunity here. And that's exactly what it is. So get creative with it. We also know that brownfields and environmental justice go hand in hand. We did a study back in 2020, right when opportunity zones came out, on the environmental risk relative to opportunity zones using environmental justice data from EJ Screen. And what we found was not surprising, is that there is a higher risk or more likelihood of encountering environmental contamination on properties in opportunity zones. So just more inherent risk there. We know that this is associated with all of the injustices that have created these communities that are suffering from, not only the brownfields, but also health disparities, crime, high crime rates, low access to various, services like healthcare, job opportunities, affordable housing, etc. And that is something that, again, especially in this webinar, we're going to think about how we're approaching this from an environmental justice and equity perspective. As we know, of course, there's a lot of opportunity here. And, just to run a recap, some of the funding that has been used over the past, 25 plus years, all of that funding, if you kind of look at that, it's about $70 million, $65 million across the country every single year in grant funding. We didn't update this because it's going to break our chart, because the Biden administration, in comparison, has issued billions of dollars in funding for assessment and cleanup grants from the EPA. It's a very popular program. It's popular between all administrations. We've seen advancements. So we know that for every dollar spent, we are leveraging at least $21 in additional funding invested back into communities. So I don't need to read this slide. I think that you covered that on the last webinar. And for time's sake, we'll move into what the risks and complications are. There's a reason why these properties are sitting idle, and it's hard to move them back into redevelopment. So this, coming back to that definition, may be complicated, right? So what are those complications? Usually it's money, right? So if you're looking at and this is actually from some partners of ours at Development Research Partners, Jesse Silverstein, who is a KSU TAB partner, technical assistance partner in Brownfields. A clean piece of property, clean piece of real estate has a basic formula of there's a market value, and then you're doing some due diligence, you have contingency, and you have, some expected, return on investment. On a brownfield site, you are inflating all of that, adding in much bigger buffers, and frankly, this stack can go up and down depending on the complications that you find on the site, which will make the project not financially feasible. So this is why a lot of these projects are sitting idle, because of the risk here and the uncertainty within that capital stack. So the other complications, resale potential, just having contaminated property, just the perception alone can create a hesitation. The property values can decrease. Public perception is definitely a factor. If the community is not feeling comfortable that this is a safe place for them to be and for their children to be, that can affect the project. You have off-site impacts, health impacts, and just funding in general. The environmental complications, not many funders want to fund environmental cleanup. Most people get scared of it. So that is why the EPA's Brownfields program exists. The Brownfields program, there's a lot of different environmental laws out there that actually apply to brownfields redevelopment, but the biggest one here is the circular liability. And circular liability is known as the Superfund liability, and it is a really very broad and robust set of legislation that applies to anybody who really touched the property. And it basically gives EPA the authority to come in and clean up these abandoned sites and to address the environmental contamination on things that are really serious health impact. But the caveat here is that they're going to then get their funding back. They're going to basically sue everybody who has had title or had a presence or had any you know, link into that site, including just being a tenant. So that kind of scared a lot of people as developers and wanting to acquire sites. It was a barrier that you don't want to get caught up in that kind of liability, which is why in 2002, there was a Brownfields amendment, which offered liability relief. And so this is really where the Brownfields program took off, is that liability relief and Brownfield Revitalization Act has allowed for, if you're doing your due diligence and you can demonstrate that you did not cause this contamination and that you are an innocent landowner or prospective purchaser, then if this were to happen, you're out of that lawsuit. That said, really what this comes down to is you are required to prove yourself, to go through that environmental liability protection in order to get funding, even for the property. So we'll go into that a little bit deeper. So again, those barriers for, I'm gonna say community-driven development. I actually put the word cloud here. I took a little screenshot of it, but funding being the big one. Property acquisition has come up quite a bit in our work as the biggest hurdle. Just having access to and acquiring the land is a big hurdle. There's airship issues, there's title issues, there's a lot of reasons why it may be hard to acquire the property. And even if you did, the funding and the leveraging is another big barrier. Establishing partnerships and organizational capacity to then manage this complexity, again, is another one that we heard. Here's a snapshot of what you said, which kind of jives. So it was a good guess on our part, and it definitely funding we're hearing over and over again, and building partnerships and capacity is where the challenges are. So how do we overcome those barriers? It really requires kind of an all hands on deck approach. It requires creative solutions. You're getting funding from a whole bunch of different sources, diverse capital stacks, multidisciplinary team that can handle project management and legal aspects and accounting and construction, etc., with subject matter experts in various different fields. I think that the most important piece here is to have a project champion. We see that over and over again because this is going to get hard all the way through. So there needs to be somebody that's overcoming and pushing the project forward. Community support is also big and can help with that project championship. Risk mitigation strategies, strategic partnerships, etc. All of that is required because now we're getting into the process, and the process really looks like this hot mess because it is a hot mess. We won't go through the hot mess because we'll all get lost. So what we're going to go through is a basic process. But know that basic process is you're gonna go back and forth around in circles quite a bit, but hopefully kind of be on this type of a path. And this is, I think, presented in the last webinar, and something that we're going to carry forward here in this webinar of the various stages of the Brownfields redevelopment process. Note this community involvement here, especially if we're taking an environmental justice and equity lens, that carries through the entire process. And I can't emphasize that enough. CClear and Groundworks have a great guide that I have a link to in the back of this presentation. But as we think about community involvement, we also have to think about the stakeholders and people on this team that are pushing things forward. So as we look at this process here, who's going through the process with you? Who's involved? And that really is dependent on the project and depending on your community, how you're defining a stakeholder versus the general public, who has skin in the game, who doesn't. And that's an exercise that you should do a deep dive on. To give an example of how you could do that, this is a stakeholder mapping exercise that we like to do with our teams and as consultants, where we're looking at not only who is all of the organizations and people and community leaders, etc., that have an interest or should have an interest and what is their stake and their influence in the project. And and just map it out. And the other thing that is interesting and useful with this exercise is, as you're mapping that out, you can identify that, say the mayor maps out over here, high influence, obviously, but if he or she doesn't have much interest in the project, that's going to be a little bit difficult. So maybe that then informs some action of how you're managing your stakeholders. And maybe there's a specific request of the mayor or a presentation to the mayor to move them over into this high interest category. Same with an activist group. Maybe they have a really high influence, but they're not really interested in what you're doing. What would make them interested in what you're doing? Others may have a lot of interest, low influence, that perhaps if put into a different position could have more influence on the project. So think about this. Happy to go back to it. Just one example. Community involvement, really grounded in the principles of environmental justice. Many of you might know of the 17 principles of environmental justice. There's a link below here. But the principle number 7 really resonates with brownfields redevelopment. It demands the right of community members to participate as equal partners at every level of decision-making, including needs assessment, planning, implementation, enforcement, and evaluation. So what that really means to me, as equal partners, there should be ownership, right? There should be ideally the community owning the properties, the community moving through the process with developers and professionals as stakeholders supporting. But what we see most of is community informed development, where the city, municipality, or developer is coming in and doing something and telling the community and being open about it and saying, well, we told them. We're really moving into this demand for community shaped, at the very least, where you are offering design charrettes, where you are asking about what goals and priorities the community has and bringing them to the table as partners in that collaboration. Even better, you're forming real partnerships with them, either as end users of the property or as co-beneficiaries of the development in various ways of that being community truly driven. And then again, ideally, the community owns it, and you have a nonprofit, a land bank, or the local government acting on the behalf of the community to really have some ownership there. So there's a full spectrum, and as we move forward, we're going to move forward kind of with an assumption that we're doing this in this community shaped, community driven area, but know that once you identify your stakeholders in the project and what you're trying to accomplish, there is a whole spectrum of how to engage community. And I think that may be on the next webinar. So let's get into the first step of this, this process. And the first step is identifying your site. So this can be as simple as like $0 cost, where you have a crayon and a map and you're just circling things, right? If you are driving, or this is me driving around town, I just happened to be at an intersection and I love taking pictures of brownfield. So I took a picture and it's now made it into every presentation I have because it is as simple as that. And you can geotag those pictures. You can, again, circle them on a map. You can get more fancy in identifying brownfields with GIS-based and professional services, but it's not necessary to get started. Just if it looks like it could be contaminated, add it to your list. And then once you have that list of the brownfield sites, and that list could be one, you just have one site in town that you just want to take care of, or you have a number of them, then you're going to prioritize them based off of what your desired criteria is. If it's a brownfields to a health field, maybe it's a health clinic or a park, and that would address priorities in your neighborhood, that's the direction you're going in, and that's what you're going to prioritize. If it's economic development, you may be selecting a site based off of its proximity to other commerce. It is very flexible. We can have a whole webinar on selection criteria. The next step in that process is doing some preliminary research on, you're looking at ownership history, environmental records, which we can introduce this in the resources. That's a platform for exploring environmental records. So what do we already know about the site? This gas station here might have a record that says you have an underground storage tank. And then you're looking for eligibility and funding. This could get complicated, and you could get confused. That is why CClear, Groundworks, and other folks in the technical assistance are available to answer those questions. But don't feel like you have to go out and hire a consultant just to identify your brownfields and get started. Okay, so the next phase, let's say we're going to pick this site right here. All right, there's a vacant lot. It looks a little sus. We're going to move it forward. Ideally, the phase 1 assessment would be when you or the organization is under contract to acquire the site. And I say that because at that point, there's a shelf life on that phase 1 environmental site assessment of 120 days. So within 120 days, you want to be able to transfer title. You don't have to, you can always redo it. But the first step, say you're going to move forward in this process and you are going to get the property donated to you, or you're going to purchase it for below market value. The first step in that process is to do all appropriate inquiry, which is basically evaluating the environmental conditions, which may be relevant to assessing potential liability for any contamination. ASTM International is an international or it's mostly US based, but it is international standard development organization that's 125 years old, has a public process for developing industry standards, everything from the steel industry to walking down an aisle in Home Depot. They have a standard for that. And they have a standard for this all appropriate inquiry phase 1. And because it's a public process, the EPA is able to adopt that as basically law. It is the equivalent of performing all appropriate inquiry. So when you go out for a consultant, an environmental professional will do this, and you're going to ask for the most recent standard and make sure it's the most recent standard. You'll know it because it has 21 after it. So this is the most recent standard of all appropriate inquiry, and it helps to identify your circle liability protection. So this is required to qualify as a bona fide prospective purchaser, innocent landowner, or contiguous property owner protection under CERCLA. So just emphasize that. Those typically cost between $2,000, it can go up to $10,000 depending on the complexity of the site. You're going to either self-fund this, but it's also an eligible expense under a community-wide assessment grant that either your municipality, the EPA directly, or your state might have. I know I'm going fast, so if you guys need to just tell me to slow down, just chime in. Okay, so more on the phase 1 assessment. So what it is, it's basically one big research report about the property. It's intended to determine not only the past and current use, but identify from that past and current use what, if any, contamination is possible. So sometimes you'll say, oh, there's definitely contamination because there's a record that says there's a leaking tank here. But there could be other records or other indications that there could have been an environmental condition. It opens the door to liability protection. Again, conduct this prior to property transfer. It has to be conducted prior to property transfer in order for you to get that liability protection. And why that's really important is because it comes down to financing. It is required for financing, especially EPA cleanup grants. If you're going to end up going after an EPA cleanup grant, you have to demonstrate that you did all appropriate inquiry prior to purchasing or acquiring the property. So what this is not, it's not just a database report, it's not a checklist. This is my favorite. It's not an ironclad defense against all liability. It's just the CERCLA liability. You still have skin in the game as a property owner to protect your property and tenants on your property, or anybody who's walking around there digging in the dirt, etc. It is not valid forever. It has to be updated. And it does not afford protections to anybody who has a copy of the report. You actually have to be named in the report or have a reliance letter in order to use the report. So you can't just say, oh, from the previous owner, oh, I already did one. Here you go. You have to do your own. Okay, so moving into this next stage, they kind of mix these together. Typically you go from a phase 2 into site assessment, or so phase 1 into the phase 2 site assessment. And then if you find something, enter it into a voluntary cleanup program. They have them kind of blurred together here, so we'll just do it together. So site assessment in general. So in the phase 1, when you identify, all right, there's a potential environmental condition here. That phase 1 is going to recommend going to a phase 2. And that is sampling either the soil gas, groundwater, building materials, etc., to confirm whether or not, or get evidence to whether or not there is a release that needs to be dealt with at the site. So that phase 2, say you found something, you might want to do additional assessment to determine how far out it went and what, what type of contamination it is. Those typically cost between, it could be a simple sampling event of $10,000, but I've seen it go over $100,000 to be able to do that. This is not something that banks typically finance. You got to figure that out. EPA this is an eligible expense under an EPA grant, and very common assessment activity that EPA would fund. So keep that in mind. And once you find contamination, say that phase 2 came back and there was contamination, it is going to really come down to a state level of whether or not and how you report that to the state, and then what process you go through to document it and to comply with the regulations. And there's various types of regulations that you may need to comply with, and that's really where you're going to get an environmental consultant involved to navigate those complexities. This is all relative to the type of contamination and the risk that it poses to human health and ecological receptors. So if a kid is on the site and they're living there all day, every day, it's a residential scenario, they're going to have a higher exposure to, say, the lead in the soil. So that is the risk that it's going to pose. Also the risk to, say, the stream nearby, and some of the other, the frogs and the bunnies and all of those good things. So that's the risk that they're assessing to, and the reporting requirements are around that. Voluntary cleanup programs, specifically, I said that there were a bunch of different programs that you can go through, but the voluntary cleanup programs are specific to brownfields. They're part of that liability relief incentive program, and EPA basically gave states the ownership of cleaning up brownfields through a regulatory process that incentivizes that cleanup, knowing that the folks that are taking on this cleanup didn't create the issue. So they're really there to help and try to get you through a process that's going to benefit everybody involved. So one example, and somebody wants to put that in the chat, bankingvelasco.org. This is a great project that we have going on here in Houston, Texas. And just again, to give you an example and a flavor of some of the types of reports that are going to come out, chemicals of concern that are discovered on site relative to human health. This is the PCL, is basically a fancy way of saying standards. You're going to get a whole lot of technical reports like this. And that's, again, working with your consultants, will start to navigate how you're going to delineate that and address that and clean it up. But go to that website because we have all of the reports there if you want to see what that's all about.
Hey, Danielle, before you move On from ESA, can you just address these two specific questions? From Dorian, how many months or years does the license need to be updated? And from Clement, how long is a phase 1 ESA valid for?
Okay, what do you mean by the licenses?
I can't recall because it must have been mentioned when you mentioned a license, but I don't know what the license is referring to. Dorian, if you want to unmute, you can clarify.
Yes, thank you. I think it was during the phase 1 licensing that you said that it doesn't last for forever. It needs to be re-updated.
Mhm.
Yeah, right there actually. Yeah.
Mhm.
How long does it have to be re-updated this licensing or this phase?
This phase. Okay, so let me answer the first question, then I'll answer that one. So this process for a phase 1, a typical phase 1, depending on your consulting agency and how complicated the site is typically 4 to 6 weeks for them to complete that report. So you have 4 to 6 weeks to complete the report. Once the report is issued, that you have about 120 days to use that report before it needs to be updated. And once you get out of that, you are able to do an update to that report. I believe it's up to a year of having that report. I could be wrong there if someone wants to fact check me. But you have some time that you can do a simple update. And a simple update could cost only, it's a less expensive than doing a full report, where they're going to just run a new check on the database and any new conditions that may have come up. So that's why typically you do these during that escrow period when the property is under contract. That said, sometimes you just want to know more about the site. So you would do a phase 1 assessment with the intent of having to do another one at the point of transaction. Does that make sense?
Yes, thank you for answering my question.
Sure. Okay. Where were we? We were here. Okay, so site visioning and reuse. Again, this is really important to get the community involved. And I love this quote from an interview at data.org. You may be a facilitator, you might be an academic, but you don't study poverty, honey, you experience it. And we need to empower those who have to not carry just the burden, but carry the solution, allow them the space to present the solution. And that's a great report about just creating data ecosystems that are equitable. And that's really it. I mean, getting the community involved at the reuse, the site visioning stage is really critically important. This is going to require not just one meeting, but bringing the community through, really understanding what they need in various aspects of that. You can fund that through a whole bunch of different ways. And I know that technical assistance programs do some of these charrettes. They will support with community engagement to make sure that we have the right folks at the table and the right voices heard. Site visioning and reuse from that reuse visioning needs to be then kind of put into a plan. So the other things that are eligible under the assessment grants from EPA and especially the technical assistance programs that for brownfields will support these. We do a lot of this just through the EPA and various other technical assistance. We're looking at climate smart brownfields. We're looking at site reuse plans, market studies, site disposition strategies, community health assessments. That's also critical in understanding what the output might be that is not just economic benefit, but also community health benefits. Resource roadmap, so finding all the funding, revitalization plans, visioning, all of that is eligible under your cleanup grants. Oh, I'm sorry, your assessment grants. And it also, once you understand what you're going to do with the property and what the community wants, that is going to dictate what the cleanup plan is. So you can remediate and you can clean up a property to a desired, you clean it up to the desired reuse. It needs to be technically and financially feasible, and it has to consider what the future occupants are. So if you're cleaning this up so that it can be an industrial site, it looks very different than if you're cleaning it up so that it can be a residential multifamily housing complex where children are going to be. So it's really important to have that first, and then you go into the cleanup planning. You're going to look at various different alternatives. The EPA calls that an analysis of brownfields cleanup alternatives. And you're going to consider things like institutional controls, simply just don't drink the groundwater, let's restrict the use, to removing the soil, to doing something more exciting. Back to the Velasco incinerator, we just happen to have this kind of snapshot of an analysis that we had done, presented at a public meeting. So you can see kind of how we weighed the different options. Option one, let's just cap it, but let's not let anybody use it. But you'd be, spending $3 million for no community benefit. We ended up with option two, where we're going to create a park system, and with a cap structure. The third option was dig it all up, but that was going to cost $20 million, and it seemed like a lot of money. So we didn't go that way. So you would do something similar to this for your cleanup plan. And this is the most complicated thing of all, is leveraging resources. Really, you need to fund a whole lot of things, not just the development. You need to fund all of this pre-work, this due diligence, the planning, etc. And there's a whole lot of different types of funding options out there to do that. There's the federal and state grants. Don't underestimate philanthropy. There's a lot of foundations out there that want to support these kinds of activities, even if it's not just the cleanup. They might want to support the end use. They might want to support programming, tax credits, traditional financing, etc. Keeping in mind that the cost to even go after the funding is still expensive. So you have to find funding to get the funding. I think you all understand that, which is why we're all here. And I wish I had a really simple, here's how you do it. But really, what we found, it's creating a pitch, create like a one-page document about your project and where you are and what you're seeking in funding that you can have in your back pocket, to shop around. Get meetings with the foundations, get meetings with your elected officials, and just shop it around. Also, your story, just from the community, the lived experience is a powerful story. Back it up with data. If you say that that you're experiencing extreme heat, do you have data to say, X amount of days out of the year we're above this this temperature, and we need cooling centers for our seniors because we had this many health incidents. Back it up with the data, but the lived experience in that story is very powerful. That's what's going to carry it, and back it up with the data. And again, shop it around. There's value in just applying, just to get your story on paper. And this is a rinse and repeat. You just keep going back and forth, figuring out, where and who will fund the project. Here's a bunch of different types of brownfields funding. You might know about these, but here's the EPA's brownfields grants. And of course, you have not only the brownfields technical assistance that can help, but you also have the regional TIC-TACs now, and the national TIC-TACs, which are the technical assistance for environmental justice, thriving communities, technical assistance centers. Cleanup. Okay, so going into cleanup, I'm being aware of timing so we can leave some time for questions. Now that you have a plan for cleanup, it's hard to come up with these slides to say, okay, here's how you're going to clean it up, because it could be as simple as taking a scoop of dirt out and we're done. It could be a big remediation system. So I thought I would present some findings from a study that we did back in 2021. Is funded by data.org with our partners at DataKind. And we created this tool, which is publicly available for your use. I have a link for it in the back. But we did a study, and we went through every organization or municipality that gets EPA funding has to report back what they did with that funding. And that's the acres database. And so there's over 25 years of data in that database that we played with, we mined. And what we found, one, is that it's a hot mess. It's very messy. There's, the garbage in, garbage out kind of philosophy applies here. So just keep that in mind. Now, this is not 100% accurate, but it does give us a really interesting view into how people are using their funding. And what we found was that the number of, actually the size of most of the properties were less than 2 acres. Most of them were a half of an acre. Which is encouraging as we're looking at funding, because a lot of people think brownfield sites are these massive industrial properties. A lot of times they're just their corner lot. So keep that in mind. The other things that we found, which were not surprising, is that the cost of cleanup is going to go up with the size of the property. The big players here in the high cost cleanups or manufacturing, rail yards, junk yards, and industrial properties. Cleanup by media and the types of contaminants found, we're finding that we're going to have a whole lot more cost the more contaminants that you have. That makes sense. PCB, these are the types of contaminants. And as this is a more beginner webinar, I don't expect you going to know all of these acronyms down here. But this also makes sense. PCBs is a really difficult thing to get out of the ground and also has very strict regulations. So we would expect that to be more contaminated. It was encouraging to see that asbestos, we were able to move through pretty quickly. And then what is impacted also was expensive. This is another thing worth noting, that the cleanup duration on most of these sites were less than 2 years. And that also could be biased because the duration of the grants are usually 2 to 3 years. So they were able to get those done pretty fast. And of course, some drag on for longer than that. But on average, we're seeing that those at the time of cleanup move pretty fast. And once you get to the redevelopment stage, yay, you did it. You're almost there. Until you find something, of course. So ongoing considerations, just a reminder to keep the community engaged through that process. And then you always have a potential of discovering a new environmental condition as you go. And there's ways of mitigating that. There's environmental insurance, there's just escrow, etc. Keep really good records. And don't forget to celebrate. Once you get to this point, there's a whole lot to celebrate, but the little wins are going to get you through that crazy process to the celebration time. So I know I don't have too much time left over. I'm going to flip through. You guys can go through this on your own. I know these slides are going to be available. If anybody wants to go through these additional resources, we put a whole bunch back here. And these are more of those ASTM standards that apply to brownfield. So that's a great resource. But I will pause. Claire, if you want to open up to those questions. I don't see the chat.
Yeah, thanks so much, Danielle. So I'll jump right in. The first question that we got was related to that cost impact on developing brownfields chart that you shared. And so the question is, why is the return on investment shown higher in the brownfield cost stack?
I think it's just relative to what you are putting in. There's a paper on that they published. I just took it from them. I think it's just proportional to that stack. So if you're investing this much money, you're going to want that proportion back. So I think it's just a proportional. Yeah.
Thanks. Okay, and this is from a participant who they're trying to obtain a city-owned property in LA County. It's in a good community, but there's contamination, and they want to know how realistic is it for a church with less than $1 million in annual revenue to gain access to funding for cleanup. I guess the question is about accessing funding. How hard is it? How difficult? Yep, for cleanup.
For cleanup, it's not that difficult. And especially if it's supported by the city. And we've had actually, I don't know if I have a picture of the nonprofit. It's not, talk to the EPA, have meetings with them, understand the intention behind it, and you may need to pull in some partners in order to it is, I don't want to say guarantee, to show programmatic capacity to be able to manage the funding. But EPA is looking for opportunities to say yes. And they, especially now under the Justice 40, they're looking for opportunities to give grassroots and community-based organizations opportunities to access federal funding.
Great, thank you. And so another question, this was around when we were talking about the brownfield inventories and understanding what type of contaminants are on the site. So the question was, where can you go for environmental records?
If you want to put so communitylattice.com/peer tool. I changed the URL tool. Okay, so this is a great place for environmental. It depends on where you are in the country. If you're in California, California has amazing databases. We created this tool called the Platform Exploring Environmental Records to basically simplify how you access these records. It's not perfect because, again, garbage in equals garbage out. Some states report more than others to the Federal Registry Service, which is the database we're pulling from. But for a large part, we're just zooming in, we have pretty much all of the environmental records that are publicly available. And I apparently zoomed into the middle of Texas where nothing is. But check this out. There's an about section that will explain what this is relative to this type of environmental record and also its risk. And the risk being defined by the likelihood of encountering contamination on the site. Major releases, you're going to find it. But, storage of chemicals might not have been released.
Thanks, Danielle. And so there was another question about, can you describe implications for properties adjacent to a brownfield site during each of the stages? So you probably don't have time for each of the stages, but your best summary with 3 minutes left.
Okay, so implications for properties next to the site. Well, so anything adjacent to just contamination, you could have. Apparently, contamination doesn't follow our laws; it follows the laws of nature. And some consultants draw that contamination stopping at the property boundary, but there is interaction over property boundaries that just being aware of. So you could actually have a brownfield site that is maybe this vacant lot that has nothing wrong with it, but it's next door to this gas station. This one qualifies still because this could be coming onto this site. So there's a whole lot of regulations and back and forth around that. I feel like I can't address that in 2 minutes, but it's complicated, but do your homework.
So there was one more comment in the chat, and Brenda, I don't know if this was a question or a comment, but it said, please repeat the 1 million, 21 million funding relationship for communities. Brenda, if you have a little more context, you can feel free to come off mute or follow up in the chat. Okay. All right, well,
that's the return stat. Like every dollar, there's a return of like 21. So if you can just elaborate on that a little bit, Danielle. I think we hear that stat a decent bit, but sometimes it kind of it gets lost in terms of what that really means for communities.
Right. So again, this comes back to the acres database too. And we're tracking for every dollar that you spend, you need to understand how much more of funding was allocated to that project. So the idea here is if EPA was not involved and didn't do a phase 1 of the property, it may still be sitting there idle. But because EPA invested $1 or say $2,000 in a phase 1, here's what it unlocked. And so what they're tracking is a bit subjective and is coming from self-reporting from various communities who have this funding, but they're going back and saying, how much did this project actually cost? Because we were able to take care of the environmental, did HUD, did you get a HUD grant? Did you get private funding? Did you get, how much more funding went into the project? Is what they're asking. So that's the leverage funding.
Yeah, thanks, Claire and Danielle. And thank you all for joining. Danielle, thanks so much for the presentation. Claire, thanks for co-hosting, and thank you all for joining. The recording and the slides will be sent out to all the participants and the registrants. So yeah, reach out if you have any other questions, but thank you all for joining, and I hope you enjoy the rest of your day. Thanks.
Thanks, everyone.
Thank you all.
Thank you.